like the laundry pile in the room's corner, death is something we will all eventually have to deal with. Because of this, dying has been greeted throughout history with complex religious ceremonies and cultural customs that teach us a lot about life. This is the one we've been dying to perform. Elite Abadoy people of the Philippines ingested massive quantities of salt water before dying, probably to dehydrate and clear their bowels in preparation for the mummification procedure. Speaking of emptying the bowels, anal evisceration is evident in Abadoy mummies, which does not seem like the most pleasant way to pass away. Following their death, the deceased's body was frequently positioned, sitting to aid in drainage, and could possibly have been placed over a fire to dry off. Tobacco smoke was eventually blasted into the dead mouths. After that, they were left to dry in the sun. It could take up to a year to complete the process. It is comparable to canning vegetables. Both a great deal of effort and patience are required. Whether they're tomatoes or mummies that have been ejected from their bowels, nothing compares to that homemade experience. Delicious. The bodies of departed loved ones are ceremoniously exhumed and cleansed by the Torajan people of Indonesia every few years. The mythological hunter, Pong Ramaset, is said to have started the custom when he discovered a dead in the mountains and decided to bury it in his own garments as the least he could. After that, he was endowed with excellent fortune. Consequently, the practice carries on with the same essence. The bones of loved ones who have not been buried are maintained pending the purification, while exhumed bodies are cleansed, exposed to the sun, and then dressed again. In any case, the corpse will be included in the upcoming Manana ceremony. As per the Buddhist tradition, human remains don't need to be preserved because a body is just a vehicle. It would be more prudent to just move the corpses into the mountains and allow the birds to feast on them. And they operate precisely in that manner. The body is cleaned and disassembled, with the flesh and bones being separated as part of the non-burial preparations. Crush the former and chop the latter, as if preparing carrots for a picky child. Then, in the wee hours of the morning, these parts are delivered to the summit of the mountain. Buddhists refer to it as giving alms to the birds, whereas Westerners refer to it as sky burial. The origins of sky burials are unknown, although they could date back over 10,000 years. Perhaps funeral establishments will begin to offer it as an affordable option. The internal organs of the deceased were removed before the body was mummified in ancient Egypt. Trained embalmers, priests slit open the side of the abdomen to withdraw the brain through the nostrils. After that, almost everything was removed from the body save the heart. It was similar to playing Operation, except with a little different objective. Because Egyptians thought the heart to be the center of intelligence and the essence of a person, it stayed in situ. Nothing was located in the intestines, liver, lungs, or stomach. Those underachievers were buried separately after being placed in some jars. The goddess of justice, truth, and order was known as Ma'at. It was also thought that in order for a person to pass to the afterlife, the gods Anubis and Thoth would measure the quality of that person's life actions by weighing that person's heart against Ma'at's feather. All of this gives the concept of watching your weight a whole new meaning. If you have them, smoke them. Particularly if you're an Anga from Papua New Guinea who smoked their deceased. The Anga prepare the deceased by scraping the corpse with rough plant stuff and then storing it in a hut for at least 30 days, even though it has been formally forbidden since 1975. The body is being drained of liquids by bamboo tubes as a smoky fire burns in the hut. Presumably, that place smells amazing. The formaldehyde in the smoke preserves soft tissue, while the heated temperatures in the hut aid in drying out the body. The whole procedure, so the story goes, is required to prevent ghosts from roaming the earth and interfering with hunting or farming. A whole thing has to go into borrowing a smoke. The custom of famarihana, or turning the dead, differs slightly throughout the regions of Madagascar. However, in general, it refers to taking a corpse out of its grave, tending to it, and then burying it again. What's the purpose? Rewriting the loved one's name on the garments and linens that they are reburied in is an important aspect of the ritual that makes sure they are never forgotten. And if you've dug someone up and undressed them, it is undoubtedly difficult to forget them. Famarihana is also a festive occasion when dance is performed to symbolize the ties that bind the living to their ancestors. This implies that Oingo Boingo was conducting an anthropological research when they recorded Dead Man's Party. The Yanomami, who are indigenous to the Amazonian rainforest, had the belief that a person's soul needs to occupy a different body after death in order to safeguard it until it travels into the spirit world. The Yanomami perform a rite that transforms human remains into food that can be consumed by the living in order to achieve this. Put another way, this ritual would have been detested by Charlton Heston. The ritual known as endocannibalism starts when the body is set on fire. After that, the bones and ash are put in a stew and cooked with bananas, which all of the departed's family devour. The controversy surrounding blood samples collected from many Yanomami people by researchers in the 1960s and 1970s brought attention to how important it is to record every part of a loved one's body. The indigenous group's representative charged that the American scientists had stolen their blood and had concealed the fact that part of it would be used for experiments. Scientists, you really put your foot in it. In ancient Greece, a mourner would typically have a three-part funeral. The prothesis, the initial component, included arranging the body. The funerary procession known as the ekphora was the second. The final step was burying the dead or cremated remains. So far, it seems like a familiar process. In order to keep the jaw from dropping immediately after death, the person tending the body closed the lips and fastened a strap around the skull. The body was then cleansed and anointed with oil before being dressed and put on display at the person's house. After the body was laid out, mourners came to offer their condolences. There were laments and singing during the occasion. And occasionally for the occasion, professional grievers were employed, which sounds like the opening of a campy David Schwimmer romantic comedy from the 90s. The body was either buried or incinerated after it arrived at the gravesite. Next, libations of wine, milk, oil, or honey were offered by mourners. In the days that followed, the significance of these refreshments was highlighted by the fact that family members kept bringing them to the cemetery as part of custom. Hey, you still need to wet your whistle. Just because you're dead doesn't imply that. Among the oldest religions in the world is Zoroastrianism. The religion developed between 1500 and 1000 BCE, mostly based on the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, a reference to the theme music from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Though we're quite sure Ahura doesn't own stock in the company, it highlights the conflict between good and evil in a world created by the god Ahura Mazda, the namesake of the Mazda automobile brand. After someone passes away, their body is dressed, cleansed, and displayed for public viewing. At that moment, a ritual known as dog sight is performed. And that's just how it sounds. A dog is dragged forward to examine the body. This is not being done to frighten the dog. Its purpose is to establish that the individual is, in fact, dead. The body is removed by white-clad corpse bearers to the summit of what they refer to as the Tower of Silence, where it is exposed to the elements and devoured by birds, after a priest prays and burns incense to purify the region. Woof. In a Roman funeral procession, the body was carried through the streets so that everyone might see it. Additionally, it was expected that individuals would make some noise in honor of their loved ones. Nevertheless, it was not required for them to wave their hands idly in the air. Women would usually be seen yelling, pulling out their hair, pounding their chests, and engaging in other expressions of grief along the procession route. The women can be relatives of the dead person. However, professional mourners were also recruited for the event, which could account for some of the more ridiculous theatrics. They were working pretty hard to get that paycheck. Additionally, musicians were selected because their degree of loudness demonstrated how essential they were. The body was probably cremated after it got outside the city limits, though burial was also an option. People offered eulogies at the tomb or burial, honoring the deceased and bemoaning their departure. After that, burial games might be played during a feast honoring the deceased. Maybe the deceased could pull a fast one in a final Monopoly game. After all, since they couldn't cheat death. The Haida people have inhabited the region along the coast of British Columbia, Canada, for more than 12,000 years, much longer than the provinces actually existed. Many of them reside on and around the islands of the Haida-Gwaii archipelago. The Haida tribe would construct a memorial or funeral pole in memory of a well-known figure. A box holding the person's remains was perched atop the intricately crafted pole. The remains were transferred to a new box and repositioned atop the pole a year later. The human remains were able to return to Earth and participate in the cycle of life when the funerary poles naturally broke down over time. For this reason, there aren't as many of these poles around anymore. However, a few still stand as skungwai on Anthony Island. But please don't try to climb them out of respect. The 13th Warrior, starring Antonio Banderas, tells the story of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a medieval Arabic traveler, who, upon the death of a Viking lord, invited one of his family's slaves, usually a young lady, to die with him. I bet you would say no, please. However, there was generally a volunteer back then. The doomed girl then drank, sang, and celebrated as her family prepared everything the departed needed in the afterlife. The whole affair sounded like a Black Sabbath show from the 1970s, until the female ritually beheaded a chicken and had sex with many of the people in attendance. Following all of that, the chosen one was sent away by an elderly woman who appeared to be the angel of death. The girl and the noble, who had both died, were arranged in a boat on top of a funeral pyre that had been lit on fire. Subsequently, Fadlan inquired as to why the burning was required and allegedly discovered that it was done to save the dead from being consumed by worms and insects. That does sound like a better route. Instead, the fire delivered them straight to paradise without any stops in worm and bug-filled.